Hey guys, tonight we're spending some time with a man named Aaron Hedges, an experienced Montana outdoorsman who walked into the crazy mountains on a hunting trip in September of 2014 and did not walk back out. He was 38 years old, capable and strong and comfortable in wild country, the kind of man who had spent his life in the mountains and knew what he was doing. And yet somewhere in that high, broken range on the way back toward camp, he became separated from his friends and lost his way. And over the next hours and days, the mountains slowly took him apart, scattering his gear across miles of ridgeline and drainage. His boots turned up in one place, his pack in another, and his body would not be found for nearly 2 years. Before we settle in for this one, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely find value in what we do here. There is no pressure and no guilt. Thank you truly for the case suggestions that keep finding their way to us. We are also now on Spotify, so the link is in the description if you would rather listen there while you drift off tonight. Now dim those lights and get comfortable. This is a long one, and Aaron's story deserves to be heard slowly and carefully. He was a husband and a father, an outdoorsman who loved the high country of Montana and had earned his confidence in it over many years. This is not a story of a crime. It is the story of how even a skilled and experienced man can be undone by a single wrong turn, by cold and confusion and the vast indifference of a mountain range, and of how his family and his community searched for him across 2 long years before the land finally gave him back. Have you ever wondered how an experienced hunter, a man who knew the wilderness, ends up scattered across 15 miles of mountains, his boots in one place and his body in another, so far from where anyone thought to look? What happens to the mind and the body in the cold that would lead a capable person to shed his own gear and wander into country he had no reason to enter? And what did his companions do in those last hours that people have questioned ever since? To understand any of it, we have to begin with who Aaron was, and with the strange, beautiful, dangerous range that took him. Aaron Joseph Hedges was born in the summer of 1976, and he made his life in Bozeman, Montana, in the heart of some of the finest and wildest country in the American West. He was, by every account, a genuine outdoorsman, not a weekend visitor to the mountains, but a man who belonged to them, who hunted and hiked and moved through high country with the ease of long practice. Bow hunting for elk, the pursuit that brought him into the crazy mountains that September, is among the most demanding forms of hunting there is. It asks you to get close, to move quietly through rough terrain, to be fit and patient and deeply comfortable in the wilderness. Aaron was all of those things. He was not a novice who wandered in over his head. He was the real article. He was also a family man, a husband and a father, with people at home who loved him and expected him back. That detail matters, because it cuts against any easy assumption about what happened to him. Aaron had every reason to come home. He was not a drifter or a man running from his life. He was someone with a wife and children and a whole ordinary world waiting for him at the end of the trip, a world he fully intended to return to, which is to say, whatever went wrong in the crazy mountains that September was not something Aaron chose. It was something that happened to him, out there in the cold, far from everyone who was waiting. To understand Aaron, you have to understand what a place like Montana does to the people who grow into it. Bozeman sits in a valley ringed by mountains, with wilderness in nearly every direction. And for a certain kind of person, that landscape is not scenery, but a way of life. Aaron was that kind of person. The mountains were where he went to feel most himself, where the ordinary weight of daily life fell away, and something older and simpler took its place. Hunting, for a man like Aaron, was not a hobby in the casual sense. It was a practice, a discipline, a way of participating in the land rather than just visiting it. And it connected him to a tradition older than the state itself. Bow hunting, in particular, is a pursuit that selects for exactly the qualities Aaron had. A rifle hunter can take game from a distance, but a bow hunter has to close that distance, has to get within a few dozen yards of an animal with senses far keener than his own, moving silently through timber and across open slopes, reading the wind and the ground. It demands patience, fitness, woodcraft, and an intimate knowledge of how to move through wild country undetected. A person does not become a capable elk bow hunter by accident or in a season. It takes years, and it builds exactly the kind of deep, earned confidence that Aaron carried into the crazies. He had every reason to trust himself in those mountains, because that trust had been justified 100 times before. That is part of what makes his story so haunting and so important. We like to believe that competence protects us, that if we just know enough and prepare enough, the wilderness will spare us. Aaron's life had taught him that lesson in reverse, that he could go into hard country again and again and come home safe, and every safe return would have deepened his confidence a little more. There is nothing wrong with that confidence. It is the natural product of real skill. But it also means that when the margins finally closed on that one particular afternoon, Aaron was a man who had every reason to believe he would be fine, right up until the moment he was not. The most experienced among us are not immune to the mountains. Sometimes they are simply the ones with the most reasons to keep going when they should stop. And behind the outdoorsman was the private man, the husband and father, whose family waited at home. We do not need to intrude on their grief to honor it. It is enough to say that Aaron was loved, that he was central to a family, that his absence tore a hole in a real and ordinary life. Every wilderness tragedy is really two stories: the story of what happened on the mountain and the story of the people who waited at the bottom of it. And the second story is always the heavier one. As we follow Aaron into the crazies, we should keep that second story in view. Somewhere below the mountains, people were expecting him for dinner, for the school run, for the small daily business of a shared life, and they would spend the next 2 years learning to live without him. Let's talk about the crazy mountains, because the range itself is central to this story, and it is unlike almost any other in Montana. The crazies are what geographers call an island range, a compact cluster of steep, high peaks that rises abruptly and alone out of the surrounding plains, unconnected to any larger chain. Because they stand by themselves, they make their own weather, catching storms and wringing them out over their summits, and their high country can turn savage with startling speed, even in early September. They are rugged in a way that punishes the careless, all sharp ridgelines and deep glacial cirques and drainages that fall away in every direction. And they are, by the standards of Montana's great wilderness, relatively small and lightly traveled, which means that a person in trouble there is very much alone. The range holds deep meaning for the Apsaluk, the Crow people, for whom these mountains are sacred ground, a place of vision and spirit woven into their history long before any hunter carried a bow into them. The very name, in English, the Crazy Mountains, comes down through a tangle of old stories and translations, and the range has always carried a certain weight in the imagination of the region, a sense of a place set apart. To be fair, none of that is supernatural, and this story has nothing to do with spirits or curses, but it is worth knowing that the Crazies are a place people have long regarded with respect and a little awe, a range that stands alone and demands to be taken seriously. The danger of the Crazy Mountains is, in a sense, out of proportion to their size, and that is exactly what makes them treacherous. They are not a huge range. A person can drive around them in an afternoon, and from the plains they look almost approachable, a compact cluster of peaks rising from the wheat fields and cattle country. That very approachability can lull people into underestimating them, but once you are inside them, the compactness works against you, because they rise so abruptly and stand so alone. They generate violent and sudden weather, catching storms that the surrounding plains never feel. Because they are small and self-contained, their terrain repeats and folds in on itself in disorienting ways. And because they are lightly traveled, with few maintained trails through the interior, a person in trouble there is far from the casual help that busier ranges provide. There is also the matter of how the range sits across the land, which shaped Aaron's story in a concrete way. The Crazies straddle the boundary between counties and are ringed, especially on their lower slopes and the plains beyond, by private ranch land. A person coming down out of the high country in the wrong direction does not emerge into a trailhead parking lot or a ranger station. They emerge into vast private range, miles of grassland and cattle country where the population is sparse, and a wandering person might not cross paths with another human being for a very long time. That geography is part of why Aaron, once the hypothermia carried him down and north, ended up so completely beyond reach. He did not stumble down into help. He stumbled down into some of the emptiest inhabited country in America, where his gear and eventually his body would lie undisturbed on private land for month after month after month. To be fair, none of this makes the Crazy Mountains uniquely deadly. People hunt and hike and climb there safely every single year, and the range is beloved precisely because it is wild and beautiful and demanding. But it is a place that rewards respect and punishes assumptions, a range whose modest size hides a genuine capacity for harm. Aaron knew the Crazies. He had every reason to feel at home in them, and that, in the end, is the quiet warning at the heart of his story, that the mountains we know best, the ones we feel safest in, are still mountains, still indifferent, still capable on the wrong day of taking even the people who love them most. You're in the Crazy Mountains on an early September day, and it is one of the most beautiful places you could ever stand. The high peaks are still streaked with the last of the summer snow. Alpine lakes sit in stone bowls, cold and clear and blue. The air is thin and sharp, and the light has the particular gold of late summer in the mountains, and elk move through the timber on the slopes below. It is paradise for a hunter like Aaron, but it is also a maze. The ridges fold and repeat. The drainages all begin to look alike, and in bad weather or fading light, the same features that make the range beautiful can make it bewildering, so that even a skilled person can lose the thread of where they are. That is the country Aaron Hedges came to hunt In the first week of September 2014, he came with two companions, men he knew and trusted, Greg Leitner, who had come over from Idaho, and Joe Depew, who was from Bozeman like Aaron. The three of them planned a week-long elk hunt in the high country, the kind of trip that experienced hunters look forward to all year. They entered from the west side of the range at the Cottonwood Lake trailhead and made their way up into the mountains to establish a base camp near a place called Campfire Lake. They brought 2 horses and a mule to carry their gear and their camp, the standard way of outfitting a serious backcountry hunt. There is a small detail about the way they traveled that would matter later, and it says something about Aaron. While the group had the horses and the mule, Aaron chose to walk in rather than ride, covering the miles on foot as the animals carried the loads. That was not unusual for a fit and capable hunter who liked to move on his own 2 feet, and it fit the kind of outdoorsman he was. He carried his bow and arrows and a handgun in his pack, while his companions carried rifles. They set up their camp, and they hunted the surrounding high country, and for the first days of the trip, everything went the way such trips are supposed to go. 3 experienced men in beautiful country doing the thing they loved. It is worth dwelling for a moment on those good days, the ones before the 7th, because they are the days Aaron would have wanted remembered, and because they make what followed land harder. Picture the camp near Campfire Lake in the first week of September, the tents pitched in the timber, the horses and the mule grazing nearby, the smell of wood smoke and coffee in the cold mornings. Picture 3 friends heading out before dawn into the high country, glassing the slopes for elk, moving quietly through the timber, sharing the particular companionship that comes from doing something hard and beautiful together in a wild place. This was the reward of a whole year of ordinary life, the trip they had planned and looked forward to, and for those first days, it was everything such a trip should be. There is no shadow over those days, no premonition, no sign that anything was about to go wrong. That is how it always is with these stories, and it is part of what makes them ache. The last good days of a person's life look exactly like ordinary good days, because that is what they are, right up until the moment the ordinary turns. Aaron, in those first days, was simply a happy man on a hunt with his friends, fit and capable and at home in the mountains, with no reason to think this trip would be any different from the many that had come before. Have you ever wondered how thin the line is between a story that ends with a tired, happy drive home and a story like this one? For Aaron and his friends, that line was a single missed turnoff on a single afternoon, with everything before it ordinary and everything after it a nightmare. We hold on to those good days deliberately because a person is more than the manner of their death. Before Aaron was a missing hunter, before he was scattered gear and a 2-year search, he was a man kneeling in the cold dawn with a bow in his hands, watching the light come up over the crazy mountains, exactly where he most wanted to be. That is the Aaron who walked into those mountains, and it is a truer picture of him than the one the tragedy tried to leave us with, which is to say, when we remember Aaron, we should remember the whole man, including the joy of those first days, and not let the darkness of the last one erase the light of the ones before it. Part of the plan involved a supply cache, a stash of food and gear left at a separate location near Sunlight Lake, to the north and east of their base camp. Caches like that are common on longer backcountry trips, a way to extend your range without carrying everything at once. It meant that the geography of the hunt was spread out, with the camp in one place and the resupply in another, and the country in between to be crossed on foot. Have you ever wondered how the smallest logistical choices, a cache placed here rather than there, a decision to walk instead of ride, can turn out to matter enormously when something goes wrong? In Aaron's story, that scattered geography, camp in one place and cache in another, would become part of the trap. On the last day anyone heard from him, it was the pull toward that distant cache that seems to have drawn him off the safe and known path and into the country that killed him. Before we follow him onto that path, it is worth understanding how getting lost actually works, because most people badly misunderstand it. We tend to imagine that lost people are careless or panicky novices, and that anyone with real experience would simply never lose their way. The truth, well documented by people who study wilderness search and rescue, is very different. Experienced outdoorsmen get lost all the time, and when they do, they get lost in a particular and dangerous way. Their very confidence works against them. A skilled person is slower to admit they are lost, quicker to believe they can correct their own error, and more likely to keep moving toward where they think they should be rather than stopping and accepting that they no longer know. There is a phenomenon that searchers call bending the map, and it is exactly what it sounds like. A person becomes convinced that the terrain around them matches the map in their head, and when the land and the map disagree, they unconsciously bend the reality to fit the belief, telling themselves that this ridge must be that ridge, that this drainage must lead where they expect. The more experienced and confident the person, the more powerfully this works, because they trust their own reading of the country. By the time the discrepancy becomes undeniable, they can be miles off course, in terrain that no longer makes sense, with the light failing and the confidence that once served them now leading them deeper into trouble. The crazy mountains are almost designed to produce exactly this failure. Because they are an island range, compact and self-contained, their ridges and drainages repeat in ways that confuse the eye. One glacial cirque looking much like the next, one timbered slope indistinguishable from another. There are relatively few trails and few obvious landmarks once you leave the main routes. In good light, with a clear head, a skilled hunter can navigate it. But add fatigue, add fading light, add the first creeping edge of cold, and the same repeating terrain that is merely confusing becomes genuinely disorienting. Have you ever wondered how a person who has read mountains their whole life can suddenly find that the mountains have stopped making sense? It happens when the country is ambiguous enough and the conditions are hard enough that even a trained mind loses its grip on where it is. That is very likely what began to happen to Aaron on the afternoon of the 7th. None of this reflects poorly on Aaron. It is simply how the human mind behaves in ambiguous country under stress, and it is why the standard advice, the advice his friends gave him, is to stop and retrace to a known point the moment you realize you are unsure. That advice exists precisely because our instinct in the moment is the opposite: to push on, to trust ourselves, to believe the next ridge will resolve the confusion. Aaron, confident and capable and drawn toward the known safety of the cache, followed the instinct rather than the advice. To be fair, most of us would feel the same pull. The difference is only that Aaron felt it in the crazy mountains, late in the day, with a storm coming, and the mountains do not forgive that pull the way gentler country might. Let's talk about the last day, Sunday, the 7th of September, because everything turns on a few hours that afternoon. The details of exactly how the group split up that day are not entirely clear, but the outcome is, at some point, Aaron was moving through the mountains apart from his companions, and late in the afternoon he made radio contact with them, and what he said was the first sign that something had gone wrong. He told them that he had missed the turnoff to camp. He was unsure of exactly where he was, and he told them his plan, which was to head north and east toward the supply cache near Sunlight Lake, rather than trying to find his way back to the base camp. Sit with that decision for a moment, because it is the hinge of the whole tragedy. Aaron had lost the turnoff, which meant he had lost his precise bearings, and instead of stopping or backtracking carefully to a known point, he chose to push on toward the cache, deeper into the country, on a line that led away from his companions and away from the camp. It is easy, from the comfort of hindsight, to see that as the wrong choice. But in the moment, to a confident and experienced hunter, it may have seemed perfectly reasonable. He knew the cache was out there. He believed he could reach it. He trusted his own skill in the mountains, the skill that had never failed him before. And so he went on, north and east, into the fading light. You're in the crazy mountains on a high ridgeline late on that Sunday afternoon, and the day is beginning to turn. The gold light is going grey. The temperature, already cool at that elevation, is starting to drop the way it always does when the sun leaves the high country. Somewhere ahead, over the folded ridges, is a cache of supplies that means safety and warmth. Somewhere behind is a camp and two friends, and in between is miles of steep, confusing terrain, ridge after ridge, drainage after drainage, all of it looking maddeningly similar as the light fails. Aaron makes his choice, shoulders his gear and starts north and east, and with every step he moves further from the people who could help him and deeper into the country where no one will find him in time. His companions, hearing his plan over the radio, told him what any experienced hunter would tell a friend who had lost the turnoff. They advised him to retrace his steps, to go back the way he had come and return to camp by the known trail, rather than strike out cross-country toward the cache. It was sound advice, the safe and standard thing. But Aaron did not take it, or could not, and that radio call, late on the afternoon of the 7th, was the last time anyone heard his voice. After that, there was only silence, and the mountains, and the coming cold of the night. Here we come to the part of the story that people have questioned ever since, and we have to walk through it carefully and fairly, because it involves real people who made real decisions under real uncertainty. When Aaron did not return, his companions were left with a hard situation. The weather was turning, a storm moving in over the range, and the two of them eventually came out of the mountains and went home. They did not, in those first critical hours and the following day, mount an immediate search for Aaron themselves. And that decision, to leave the mountains as a storm arrived, rather than to stay and look for their missing friend, has been second-guessed by many people in the years since. To be fair to Greg Leitner and Joe Depew, we should be very careful here, because it is easy to judge from a warm room years later, and much harder to know what the right call was in the moment. They were two men facing an incoming storm in dangerous high country, with a companion who was an experienced outdoorsman and who had told them a specific plan to head for a stocked supply cache. It is entirely possible they believed Aaron would reach that cache, hunker down, and be fine, as an experienced hunter often would. It is possible they judged that staying out in a storm themselves would only create more people in danger. We were not there, and we do not know what they knew or feared in those hours. What we can say is that they came out and Aaron did not, and that the gap between those two facts is something they have had to live with and something that has fueled hard questions ever since. Have you ever wondered how much of a tragedy like this lives in the small decisions, the ones that seem reasonable at the time and only look fatal afterward? Aaron's decision to push on toward the cache, the companion's decision to come out ahead of the storm, the advice to retrace given and not taken. None of these were made by careless or malicious people. They were made by experienced outdoorsmen doing their best to read an uncertain and dangerous situation. And yet, chained together, they led to a man alone in a storm in the high crazies, with night coming on and the temperature falling, and no one on their way to help him. The tragedy was not a single terrible act. It was a series of ordinary judgments that together left Aaron on his own at the worst possible moment. The weather is the silent third character in that chain, and it deserves its due because it turned a difficult situation into a deadly one. Early September in the high, crazy mountains sits right on the knife edge of the seasons. The days can still feel like late summer, warm and golden, but the nights are cold at that elevation, even in fair weather, and a change can come in fast and hard. On the days around Aaron's disappearance, the weather turned, a storm moving in over the range, dropping temperatures and bringing the kind of wet, cold, windy conditions that are the perfect engine for hypothermia. Cold alone is dangerous. Cold plus wet is far worse because water strips heat from the body many times faster than air. Cold plus wet plus wind is worse still. And Aaron, out on foot with a light gone and no shelter, would have met some version of all three. You're in the high country as that front arrives, and you can feel the mountains change character in the space of an hour. The gold goes out of the light. The wind picks up, carrying the smell of the coming storm. The temperature, already dropping with the sun, falls faster now, and the first cold rain or spitting snow begins to move across the ridges. For a person warm and sheltered in a tent, it is merely weather, the ordinary drama of a mountain evening. For a person alone and lost and on the move, without the layers or the shelter to meet it, that same front is a slow closing trap, each degree of falling temperature narrowing the odds of survival. Aaron walked into that trap not through any single reckless act, but simply by being in the wrong place when the weather turned, on the wrong side of a missed turnoff, with night and the storm coming down together. It is worth remembering how quickly this can happen, because it is the part people most underestimate. Hypothermia does not require Arctic conditions or a blizzard. It can kill in temperatures well above freezing, especially when a person is wet, tired, and exposed to wind over many hours. A cold, rainy night in the mountains, the kind that thousands of people sleep through safely in their tents every year, becomes lethal the moment you are caught out in it without protection. Aaron was an experienced man who surely knew all of this in the abstract, but knowing the danger of exposure and being caught in it alone and already disoriented, are two very different things, and the gap between them is where the mountains do their quiet killing. When it became clear that Aaron was truly missing, the response was large and determined. This was not a case that anyone took lightly. Aaron was a known and experienced outdoorsman, and the people of that part of Montana understood exactly how serious it was for a man like him to be overdue in the high crazies with a storm on the ground. Over roughly 12 days, stretching to the latter part of September, one of the most intensive search efforts the region had mounted took shape across the range. It brought in helicopters, both military and civilian, equipped with infrared cameras and night vision to scan the mountains for the heat of a living body or any sign of a person below. It brought in something like 20 dog teams and horse teams and more than 50 ground searchers, along with a specialized team trained for the high, difficult elevations where Aaron had last been headed. They searched the country east of the small town of Wilsall, in the rugged terrain straddling the line between Park and Sweetgrass counties, working the ridges and drainages where Aaron might have gone. And in the course of that search, they began to find things, pieces of Aaron scattered across the mountains, though not Aaron himself. They found his boots, they found a pack he had carried for water, and they found the remains of two separate attempts to start a fire, small, heartbreaking signs of a man trying to keep himself alive in the cold. Each discovery was a thread, a point on the map that said Aaron had been here and here and here. But the threads did not lead to him. They only showed that he had been moving, strangely and widely, through the range, shedding his gear as he went. You're in the eastern Crazy Mountains during those September search days, and every discovery deepens the mystery rather than solving it. Here are his boots, an experienced hunter's boots, found where no one would expect a man to leave them. Here is his water pack. Here the char and ash of a fire he tried and failed to build into safety. The searchers reading these signs would have felt a growing dread, because the pattern they were tracing did not look like a man calmly walking out. It looked like a man in trouble, moving without clear direction, leaving behind the very things he needed most. It looked, to anyone who understood the mountains and the cold, like the signature of hypothermia. The scale of that search deserves to be dwelt on, because it says something about how hard people fought to bring Aaron home. This was not a token effort. The helicopters flying the range carried infrared cameras designed to pick up the heat of a human body against the cold mountainside. Technology that can find a living person in country the eye would never search in time. The dog teams, some 20 of them, worked the drainages trying to catch a scent the wind and weather had not yet erased. Horse teams pushed into terrain too rough for vehicles. More than 50 people on the ground walked grids across the mountains, and a specialized team trained for high and difficult elevations pressed into the country where Aaron had last been headed. It was, by any measure, a serious and well-resourced search, the kind that finds most of the people it goes looking for. You're in a search command post in those September days, and the mood is a strange mixture of determination and dread. Every morning the teams go out with hope. Every evening they come back with a little less of it, and sometimes with a new piece of the puzzle that only deepens the fear. A pair of boots, a water pack, the ashes of a fire that did not save him. Each discovery is plotted on a map, and the map slowly fills with points that do not connect into any sensible line. points that scatter across the range in a way that speaks of a man not walking out but wandering. The searchers are good at their work, among the best in the region, and yet the mountains keep handing them fragments instead of answers, pieces of Aaron without Aaron, until the map itself begins to look like the record of something that has already ended. The hardest part, for searchers and family alike, is the particular torment of clues without a conclusion. A body would have been terrible, but it would have been an answer. Instead, the search kept producing these fragments, each one proving Aaron had been somewhere, and none of them proving where he was now. For a family standing at the edge of the mountains, waiting for word, that is an almost unbearable form of hope, endlessly renewed and endlessly disappointed. To be fair to the searchers, they were fighting an almost impossible problem. The very thing that had happened to Aaron, the long hypothermic wandering, had carried him outside the logical search area entirely, so that the harder they searched the country where he should have been, the further they were from the country where he actually was. They were looking thoroughly and skillfully in the wrong place, because Aaron had gone somewhere no reasonable search would have thought to look. After roughly 12 days, the intensive phase of the search wound down. It is one of the hardest decisions in all of search and rescue, the moment when an active search for a living person becomes something else, a recovery, a waiting, a hope deferred to some future season. No one makes that call lightly, and no one who loved Aaron truly accepted it. But the practical reality was stark. The odds of a man surviving that long, alone and exposed in the high crazies after a storm, were essentially gone. And the searchers could not keep 50 people and 20 dog teams and a fleet of helicopters in the mountains forever. So the search stood down, and the range fell quiet, and the question of where Aaron had gone passed from the searchers to the mountains themselves, which would answer it slowly and in their own time across the next 2 years. Let's talk about hypothermia, gently and carefully, because it is almost certainly the key to everything that happened to Aaron, and understanding it turns a baffling set of clues into a coherent and deeply sad picture. Hypothermia is what happens when the body loses heat faster than it can produce it, and the core temperature begins to fall. In its early stages, it brings shivering and clumsiness, but as it deepens, it does something crueler. It attacks the mind. A severely hypothermic person becomes confused and disoriented, loses the ability to think clearly or make good decisions, and can behave in ways that seem baffling to anyone looking on afterward. The cold does not just freeze the body, it unmoors the mind, and a person in that state is no longer fully able to help themselves. There is a specific and well-documented phenomenon that likely explains the most haunting detail of Aaron's case, the shed boots and gear. It is called paradoxical undressing. In the late stages of severe hypothermia, as the body's temperature regulation collapses, a person can suddenly feel a false and overwhelming sensation of heat, a burning warmth that is entirely an illusion created by the failing body. In response, they may begin to remove their clothing, their boots, their gear, convinced they are too hot when in fact they are freezing to death. It is one of the recognized signs of fatal hypothermia, and rescuers and investigators encounter it again and again in cold weather deaths. To be fair, we cannot be certain that is what happened to Aaron, but it fits the evidence so precisely, the boots left in one place, the gear in another, that it is very likely the explanation. Understanding paradoxical undressing changes how we read the whole trail of scattered belongings, and it does so in a way that is important for Aaron's memory. The shed boots do not mean Aaron was careless or foolish, or that he simply gave up. They mean he was in the grip of a physiological process that was destroying his judgment, that the cold had reached into his mind and taken away his ability to act in his own interest. The man who left those boots behind was no longer fully the experienced outdoorsman who had walked into the mountains. He was a person whose body and brain were failing together, doing things that made a terrible kind of sense from inside the illusion of hypothermia, even though they hastened his death. Which is to say, the scattered gear is not evidence of a mistake. It is evidence of how completely the cold had already taken hold. It is worth walking through the stages of hypothermia carefully, because doing so turns Aaron's baffling final hours into something we can actually understand and grieve. In the mild stage, the body fights back, shivering hard to generate heat, and the mind is still mostly clear, though judgment is already beginning to slip. This is the stage where good decisions still matter, where stopping to build shelter and warmth can still save a life. As the core temperature falls further into the moderate stage, the shivering may become violent and then, ominously, begin to fade, and the confusion deepens. Speech slurs, coordination fails. The person may become apathetic or strangely calm, no longer fully aware of the danger they are in. This is where the ability to save oneself begins to disappear. In the severe stage, the body's systems start to shut down, and the mind goes with them. It is here that the strangest behaviors appear, the paradoxical undressing we have already described, and sometimes another documented phenomenon called terminal burrowing, in which a dying person crawls into a small, enclosed space, under a bush or a rock or into dense cover, in what seems to be a last primitive instinct. These behaviors have been recorded again and again in cold weather deaths, and they are not signs of madness or panic. They are the final acts of a brain being switched off by the cold, running on ancient reflexes after conscious thought has failed. When we picture Aaron shedding his boots or wandering far off any sensible route, we are watching not a series of choices, but the tragic mechanics of a body dying by degrees. The failed fires fit this picture with painful precision. Building a fire in the cold requires exactly the faculties that hypothermia destroys first: fine motor control in the fingers, patience, clear sequential thinking. A man whose hands have gone numb and clumsy, whose mind is beginning to fog trying to strike a spark and nurse a flame in the cold and perhaps the wet, is fighting a battle that gets harder at the very moment he most needs to win it. That Aaron tried at least twice tells us he understood his danger and fought it with everything he had left. That the fires did not hold tells us how far the cold had already progressed. Have you ever wondered what it would be to know exactly what you need to do to survive, and to feel your own body refusing to let you do it? That may have been Aaron's experience in those hours, and it is among the most heartbreaking things a person can face. Understanding all of this matters most for how we remember Aaron, and it is why we have spent this time on it. Without the science, his final hours look like a catalogue of errors, a skilled man inexplicably doing foolish things, and that reading is both wrong and unkind. With the science, the same hours become the story of a capable man overwhelmed by a physiological process no amount of skill can fully resist, fighting it with fires and movement and endurance long past the point where most people would have stopped. To be fair, we cannot narrate his exact thoughts. and we will not pretend to. But the pattern of the evidence read through what we know about hypothermia tells us clearly that Aaron did not fail himself. His body failed him in the specific and merciless way that cold kills, and he resisted that failure with a courage that the scattered clues, properly understood, actually reveal. The official search could not go on forever. After roughly 12 days, with the weather worsening and no living trace of Aaron found, the intensive effort was scaled back, and the mountains kept their silence through the long Montana winter. For Aaron's family, that winter must have been its own kind of ordeal. Knowing their husband and father was somewhere in the high country, unreachable, while the snow piled deep over whatever the mountains were hiding. They did not have him back, and they did not have answers. Only the scattered clues the search had found, and the terrible arithmetic of a man missing in the cold for months. Then, the following summer, in June of 2015, the mountains began to give up more of Aaron's story, and it was stranger than anyone had expected. More of his gear was discovered, far to the north of where he had last been heard from, well down out of the high country toward the plains. Searchers and landowners found his bow and a backpack with his equipment and field clothing and even his hunting license, the documents that confirmed beyond doubt that this was Aaron's gear. And the location was astonishing. It was found miles and miles from the base camp, near a ranch far to the north, on private land at the very edge of the mountains, in country that no reasonable route back to camp would ever have crossed. That discovery reshaped the entire understanding of what had happened. Aaron had not simply gotten turned around near camp and died close by. He had traveled an enormous distance, down out of the high crazies and toward the northern plains, far beyond where any searcher had thought to concentrate. The scattered gear now traced a long, wandering, downhill line leading north, and it told the story of a man who had kept moving for hours and probably through the night, covering ground at a pace and in a direction that made no sense for someone trying to reach camp or the cache, but made a terrible kind of sense for someone in the confusion of deepening hypothermia, simply moving, drawn downhill and onward by an instinct that had outlived his reason. You're in the ranch country north of the crazy mountains, where the peaks give way to grassland, and you are standing far from anywhere a lost hunter should ever have ended up. This is not the high country. This is the edge of the plains, the ranch land at the foot of the range, and yet here is Aaron's gear, his bow and his pack and his clothing, scattered near a family's ranch miles beyond the search. The distance is the thing that stops you. To have come this far on foot, off any trail, through the night and the cold, is a feat of desperate endurance that is almost impossible to imagine, and it tells you how long Aaron fought and how far the failing engine of his body carried him before it finally stopped. The final answer came more than a year after that, in the summer of 2016. On the 5th of August, nearly 2 full years after Aaron had vanished, a rancher came upon human remains on private land west of the small community of Melville in Sweetgrass County, out in that same northern country where Aaron's gear had been found. With the remains was a cell phone. A few days later, on the 9th of August, dental records confirmed what everyone by then feared and expected. The remains were Aaron Hedges. After 2 years of not knowing, of searching and waiting and hoping against reason, his family finally had him back and finally knew where his long, terrible journey had ended. There is a quiet significance in how he was finally found, and it is worth sitting with. Not a helicopter with infrared cameras, not a specialized high country team, not any of the technology and organization that had thrown itself at the mountains 2 years before. It was a rancher, an ordinary person on his own land, going about the business of a working ranch, who came upon the remains in that northern country. After all the sophistication of the modern search, it came down in the end to the oldest thing of all, a human being walking the land closely enough to notice what was there. The mountains and the plains give up their secrets on their own schedule, and usually to whoever happens to be paying attention when the moment comes. The identification was handled with the care such things require. Human remains left in the open for 2 years do not always yield an easy answer, but dental records, compared a few days after the discovery, confirmed what the location and the nearby gear had already strongly suggested. This was Aaron, the cell phone found with him, the proximity to his bow and pack, the whole grim geography of it, all of it lined up. For the officials who made that confirmation, it was the end of a long, open file. For Aaron's family, it was something far heavier and far more personal, the end of 2 years of suspension, the moment the worst possibility became a settled and unbearable fact, and also, strangely, a kind of release from the exhausting work of not knowing. Imagine receiving that news after 2 years. There is grief in it, of course, fresh and terrible, the final closing of any faint hope that Aaron might somehow still be alive out there. But there is also, woven through the grief, the thing the family had needed for 2 long years, which is simply an answer. They knew now. They knew where he had gone and roughly what had happened and where his journey had ended. They could bring him home and bury him and begin the ordinary human work of mourning that a disappearance had denied them for so long. To be fair, no one would ever call it good news. But after 2 years in the country of not knowing, even the hardest certainty carries a mercy inside it, the mercy of an ending, and Aaron's family, at last, was allowed to have one. The distances, when they were all laid out, told the whole story of that journey in stark numbers. Aaron's remains were found roughly 15 miles from where he had made his last radio contact, an enormous distance to have traveled on foot through that kind of country. They lay about 6 miles from where his boots had been found, and only about half a mile from where his bow and pack had turned up the year before. To be fair, some of the exact figures vary a little between accounts, but the shape of it is undeniable. Aaron had walked or staggered an astonishing distance, shedding his gear across miles of mountains and foothills until at last, somewhere in that northern country far from camp and far from the cache and far from anyone who could help him, the cold finished what it had begun, and he lay down for the last time. The 2 years between Aaron's disappearance and the recovery of his remains were not empty years, and it would be wrong to skip over them. Through that whole long stretch, people kept Aaron in mind and kept, in various ways, looking. The country where his gear had turned up, out on the private ranchland north of the mountains, was worked and walked by the people who lived there, and it was ultimately one of them, a rancher on his own land, who found what 2 years of organized searching had not. There is something fitting in that Aaron was found not by a helicopter or a specialized team, but by an ordinary person going about life on the land itself finally surrendering him to someone who happened to be paying attention. You're in the ranch country at the foot of the crazies across those 2 years, and life goes on the way it does. The cattle and the seasons and the long Montana winters, while somewhere out in the folds of that ground, Aaron lies waiting to be found. It is a strange thing to know that a person is out there, unrecovered, in country people cross all the time, and that finding him depends on the smallest of chances. A rancher riding a particular draw, a hunter cresting a particular rise. The land is vast and folded and good at keeping what it holds. For 2 years it kept Aaron, until the chance finally came, and a person walking that ground came upon the remains and the cell phone, and understood with a sinking heart what they had found. For the family, those 2 years were a form of suspended grief that anyone who has lived through an ambiguous loss will recognize. They could not fully mourn, because mourning needs a certainty that a disappearance withholds. They could not fully hope, because reason told them what the odds were. They lived in between, through the discovery of the boots, and then the gear far to the north, each find reopening the wound without closing it. To be fair, there's no good way to live through such a thing, and no timeline that makes it bearable. But there is a difference between grief with an answer and grief without one. And for 2 long years, Aaron's family was denied the answer, held in the hardest country of all, the country of not knowing, until a stranger on a Montana ranch finally brought them across its border. Let's try to reconstruct what those hours were like for Aaron, gently and without pretending to more certainty than we have, because he deserves to have his last journey understood rather than left as a set of scattered clues. It seems to have begun with that missed turnoff on the afternoon of the 7th. Aaron, unsure of his position, chose to head for the Sunlight Lake cache rather than backtrack, and set off north and east into increasingly difficult country as the light failed and the temperature dropped. That first night alone in the high crazies would have been cold, perhaps wet, and Aaron was on foot, moving, burning energy and losing heat. Somewhere in there, the cold began to win, and the first stages of hypothermia crept in, the shivering, the clumsiness, the slow fog settling over his thoughts. We know he tried to save himself, because the searchers found the evidence of it. There were the remains of 2 separate attempts to build a fire, 2 moments when Aaron, cold and probably frightened, stopped and tried to make heat and light against the dark. Picture that, a capable man kneeling in the cold, working with failing fingers and a failing mind to coax a flame that would mean survival, and not being able to make it hold. Those failed fires are among the most heartbreaking details in the whole case, because they show Aaron doing exactly the right thing, fighting to live and being defeated not by any lack of will, but by the cold that was already taking his coordination and his judgment. Have you ever wondered how cruel it is that the very thing threatening your life, the cold, is also the thing stealing your ability to fight it? That is the trap Aaron was caught in. You're in the cold dark of that first night in the mountains with a person whose body is beginning to fail, and the tragedy is that the harder it gets, the less able he is to help himself. His fires will not catch. His hands do not work the way they should. His thoughts, once sharp and practiced, are slowing and scattering. The mountains around him are black and enormous and all the same, offering no landmark, no direction, no mercy. And somewhere in the depths of that night, as his core temperature falls toward the point of no return, the cruelest stage arrives, the false heat of paradoxical undressing, and Aaron begins to shed the gear that might have saved him, his boots, his pack, driven by an illusion of warmth that is really the beginning of the end. What followed was the long, strange, downhill wandering that the scattered gear traced across the miles. No longer able to navigate or reason, Aaron kept moving, and the movement carried him north and downhill, out of the high country and toward the plains, mile after mile, far beyond any route that made sense. This is a documented pattern in hypothermia and disorientation, a person continuing to move without purpose, often downhill, long after conscious navigation has failed. Aaron covered a distance that seems impossible, something like 15 miles from where he was last heard, shedding his belongings as he went, until at last, in that northern ranch country far from the mountains, his body simply stopped, and he lay down, and the exposure took him. He had fought, by any measure, an extraordinary fight. He had simply been fighting something that skill and strength alone could not beat. The direction of Aaron's wandering is itself worth understanding, because it fits a known and tragic pattern. Lost and hypothermic people tend to move downhill, following the path of least resistance, drifting with the terrain rather than against it. Going up is hard, and a failing body chooses the easy line, and the easy line in the mountains almost always leads down along the falling drainages toward the lower country. For Aaron, downhill and generally north meant away from the high basins where his camp and the cache lay, and out toward the plains. Every step that felt easier was a step further from safety and from the search that would come looking for him in the high country. The land itself, through the simple physics of gravity and fatigue, was drawing him in exactly the wrong direction, and his failing mind had no way to correct for it. The sheer distance he covered is almost hard to believe. Something like 15 miles separated the place of his last radio call from the place his body was finally found, and that distance was crossed on foot, off any trail, through rough country, in deteriorating condition, very likely through the night and into the following day. Think about what that means. Even as hypothermia stole his judgment and his coordination, some deep engine of endurance kept Aaron moving, hour after hour, mile after mile. It is a testament to his fitness and his will, and it is also part of the tragedy, because that same endurance carried him steadily out of reach, turning what might have been a recoverable emergency near camp into a body lost in ranch country a day's hard travel away. Have you ever wondered whether strength itself can sometimes be a curse, when it keeps a failing person moving in the wrong direction, long past the point where stopping might have saved them? Aaron's long, doomed march north is a hard example of exactly that. We will never know the precise route he took, the exact ridges he crossed, or the streams he followed, or the choices, if we can even call them choices, that shaped his path. The scattered gear gives us only a rough line, a handful of points across the miles, and the country between them keeps its silence. But we can say that it was a long and lonely journey, taken in the dark and the cold by a man whose mind was no longer his own, moving with terrible persistence toward country he had no reason to enter. To be fair, there is no making that anything but sad, but there is, buried in it, something almost heroic too, the refusal of Aaron's body to stop, the sheer animal determination to keep going, even when going served no purpose the conscious mind could name. He did not lie down easily. He walked until he could not walk anymore, and only then did the cold finally have him. There's one more small, painful detail that speaks to how alone Aaron was in all of this. When his remains were found, his cell phone was with him. In our age, a phone can feel like a lifeline, a way to call for help from almost anywhere. But the high, crazy mountains have little or no cellular signal, and a phone in that country is often just a dead weight of glass and metal, unable to reach anyone. Aaron may well have tried to call for help, may have held that phone and watched it fail to find a signal in the hours when a single connection could have saved his life. We do not know, but the phone found with his body is a quiet reminder that he was beyond the reach of the ordinary help the rest of us take for granted, alone in a way that is hard to fully imagine. That cell phone is worth pausing on, because it points to one of the quiet dangers of our own age, the illusion of safety that technology creates. We have grown so used to being reachable, to having a map and a lifeline in our pocket at all times, that it is genuinely hard to imagine being truly out of contact. We plan trips with a half-conscious assumption that if something goes wrong, we can simply call for help. But the backcountry does not honor that assumption. Across much of the Wild West, and certainly in the interior of a range like the Crazies, there is no cellular signal at all, and a phone becomes exactly what Aaron's became, a dead rectangle of glass, useless in the one moment it was supposed to save you. There is a real danger in the false confidence that technology breeds, and it is worth naming plainly. A person who believes they can always call for help is a person who may take risks they would never take if they truly understood their isolation, may push a little further, stay a little longer, worry a little less about the margin. The phone in the pocket whispers that help is always a call away, and in the backcountry, that whisper is a lie. Have you ever wondered how many people have died in the wilderness while carrying a phone that could not find a signal, believing, right up until the crisis, that they were more connected and more safe than they actually were? Aaron may or may not have fallen into that trap, and we should not assume he did. But the phone found with his body stands as a small, sad symbol of it, a reminder that in the deep wild, we are as alone as human beings have always been, whatever miracle of glass and circuitry we happen to be carrying. The older tools, in the end, are the ones that save lives out there, and they are unglamorous, a map and compass and the skill to use them, which never lose their signal, warm layers and the discipline to put them on early, a plan left with someone at home, the judgment to turn back. None of these are exciting, and all of them are more reliable in a true wilderness emergency than the phone we have all come to depend on. To be fair, technology has saved many lives too, and satellite messengers now exist that can summon help from almost anywhere. But the deepest lesson of a case like Aaron's is that the wilderness is still the wilderness, still capable of putting a person entirely beyond reach, and that the humility to prepare for that isolation is worth more than any device that pretends to abolish it. That leaves us with the hard questions, the ones people have turned over ever since, and we should face them honestly, even though most of them have no clean answer. Why did Aaron head for the cache instead of retracing his steps as his friends advised? We cannot know, but it was very likely the confident choice of an experienced man who trusted his own ability and believed he could reach a known point of safety. Why could the search, as large as it was, not find him? Because Aaron was not where anyone reasonably thought to look. The hypothermia had carried him far outside the search area, down toward the plains, into private ranch country miles beyond the high terrain the searchers were combing. They were looking in the mountains. Aaron, by then, had already left them. And then there is the hardest question, the one about his companions. And here we have to hold both truth and fairness at once. Would Aaron have survived if Greg Leitner and Joe Depew had stayed and searched immediately rather than coming out ahead of the storm? Possibly. An earlier search, a faster response in those first hours, might have reached him while he was still alive and still close. But we genuinely do not know, and it is not fair to lay Aaron's death at their feet. To be fair, they were experienced men making a defensible call in a dangerous moment, and they have had to live with the outcome in a way that no outside judgment could make heavier. The honest truth is that this tragedy had many small authors: the weather, the terrain, a missed turnoff, a series of reasonable decisions, and the cold, and that no single one of them is the villain of the story. There is no villain. There is only a good man lost to the mountains, and a chain of ordinary moments that ended in an extraordinary loss. We should linger on that point about the companions, because it is where this case becomes not just a wilderness tragedy, but a mirror for how we judge one another. In the years since Aaron's death, the decision by Greg Leitner and Joe Depew to leave the mountains rather than stay and search has been discussed and debated and, at times, harshly condemned by strangers who were not there. It is easy to understand the impulse. When someone we hear about dies alone in the cold, we want there to have been a way to prevent it, and the companions who came out safe make an easy target for that longing. If only they had stayed. If only they had searched. If only they had refused to leave without him. But the honest position requires more humility than that. None of us were on that ridge as the storm came in. None of us knows exactly what was said, what was feared, what the weather was doing, what the two men believed about Aaron's chances of reaching the cache and sheltering. Experienced outdoorsmen know that going out into a storm to search rough country in darkness can turn one missing person into three, and that sometimes the responsible thing, the thing that keeps the most people alive, is to get out, raise the alarm, and let an organized search take over. Whether that was the right call here, we cannot say with certainty, and the people best positioned to know are the ones who have had to carry the outcome, which is to say, the comfortable judgment of a stranger years later is worth very little against the terrible weight the companions themselves have surely borne. This channel will not add to that pile of judgment because it would be both unkind and dishonest. What happened to Aaron was not a crime, and his companions were not perpetrators. They were his friends, and they lost him, and they have lived ever since with the questions that everyone else only gets to ask from a safe distance. To be fair, it is possible to believe that a different decision might have saved Aaron and still refuse to condemn the men who made the decision they did under pressure, in good faith, with incomplete knowledge. Both of those things can be true at once. Holding them together, rather than collapsing into blame, is what fairness actually requires. Aaron deserves the truth of what happened. His friends deserve the presumption that they did their honest best in an impossible moment. And the rest of us deserve the reminder that we too might have chosen wrong in their place and would want mercy if we had. Let's step back and think about what Aaron's story tells us, because it carries a lesson that every person who loves the wilderness needs to hear, and it is not a comfortable one. Aaron Hedges was not careless. He was not inexperienced. He was not a fool who wandered into country beyond his ability. He was a genuine outdoorsman, fit and skilled and comfortable in the mountains, exactly the kind of person we imagine as safe. And the wilderness took him anyway, through a single missed turnoff and a falling temperature and the slow treachery of the cold. If it could happen to Aaron, it can happen to anyone. And that is the hard truth at the center of his story. Competence buys margin, not immunity. The mountains do not care how experienced you are. Aaron's death, for all its particular details, is part of a larger and sobering pattern that plays out quietly every year across the mountain west. Each hunting season, each hiking season, the wilderness claims people, and a striking number of them are not novices, but capable, experienced outdoorsmen, exactly the people we would least expect to die out there. They get caught by weather, by a fall, by a wrong turn, by the slow treachery of the cold, and many of them die of exposure within reach of help they cannot summon. Aaron was not a strange exception to how skilled people usually stay safe. He was, sadly, a clear example of how skilled people sometimes die, undone by the same overconfidence and the same thin margins that his very experience helped create. We do not often hear these stories because most of them are not mysteries. A hunter is found quickly, the cause is plain, the news is local and brief, and the world moves on. What set Aaron's case apart, and what made it linger, was the scattered gear and the 2-year search, the mystery of the boots and the 15 miles, the way his death refused for so long to resolve. But underneath the unusual details is a very usual tragedy, the kind that happens more often than we like to admit. Have you ever wondered how many capable, careful people the mountains take each year, while the rest of us assume that our own skill would surely protect us? The number is larger than most of us imagine, and every one of those people was, like Aaron, someone who believed, right up until the end, that they knew what they were doing. To be fair, most of the time, that belief is justified. The wilderness is usually survivable, and experience usually saves you. But usually is not always, and the gap between them is exactly where Aaron and too many like him have been lost. There is a particular cruelty in hypothermia that makes it worth understanding for anyone who ventures into cold country. Unlike a fall or a sudden injury, hypothermia does its work slowly and quietly, and worst of all, it disables the very faculties you would need to save yourself. It steals your judgment before it steals your life, so that a person in its grip makes worse and worse decisions precisely when good decisions matter most. Aaron's fires that would not catch, his shed boots, his long wandering in the wrong direction, these are not the marks of a man who failed. They are the marks of a man whose own mind had been turned against him by the cold. Which is to say, the enemy in Aaron's story was not the mountain or the distance or even his own choices, but the physics of heat leaving a human body faster than it could be replaced. You're in the high country in the years after Aaron's death, and hunters and hikers still move through these mountains, still take the same risks, still trust their own skill the way Aaron trusted his. Most of them come home, as Aaron did dozens of times before the trip that killed him. That is the thing to hold on to. The wilderness is not a villain, and it is not usually deadly. And the answer to Aaron's story is not fear. It is respect, the kind of respect that keeps a spare layer in the pack, that stops and shelters early rather than pushing on, that treats a missed turnoff as a moment to halt rather than a problem to power through. Aaron knew all of that. On another day, it would have been enough. The margins in the mountains are simply thinner than we like to believe. If there is a practical lesson in Aaron's story, it is one that search and rescue professionals repeat constantly, and it can be summed up in a single word: stop. The moment you realize you are unsure of where you are, the safest thing to do, almost always, is to stop moving. Stop, stay calm, and think, rather than pressing on toward where you believe safety lies. A person who stays put is far easier to find than a person who keeps wandering, and a person who stops early while still warm and clear-headed can build shelter and preserve heat before the cold takes their judgment. The whole tragedy of hypothermia is that it punishes the instinct to keep going and rewards the discipline to halt. Aaron's long march north is, in a sense, the shadow of the advice he did not follow, the advice to stop and retrace to a known point the moment the country stopped making sense. The other lessons are the humble ones that experienced people sometimes let slip precisely because they are experienced. Carry more warmth than you think you need, because the night you get caught out is the night you will need it. Tell someone exactly where you are going and when you will be back, so that a search can start early and in the right place. Treat the first sign of being lost as an emergency to be managed calmly, not a small problem to be powered through, and respect the cold as the patient killer it is, more dangerous in its quiet way than the dramatic hazards we tend to fear. To be fair, Aaron surely knew every one of these things. Knowing them and applying them in the confused, confident, deteriorating reality of an actual emergency are not the same, which is exactly why these lessons have to be repeated, and why a story like Aaron's, told with care, might help someone else stop when they should. Aaron's case has become, in the years since, something that the outdoor community studies, and there is real value in that, as long as it is done with respect. People who spend their lives in wild country have looked hard at what happened to him, tracing the chain of decisions, the weather, the terrain, the physiology, not to assign blame but to learn. Because Aaron was so experienced, his death carries a particular weight for other experienced people. It is easy to dismiss the death of a careless novice as something that would never happen to you. It is much harder and much more useful to sit with the death of a skilled outdoorsman and ask honestly whether you might have made the same choices, felt the same confidence, followed the same fatal pull toward the cache instead of the safe retreat. The answer for most honest people is yes, and that yes is exactly why his story matters. There is a responsibility in telling a story like this, and it is worth naming. It would be easy to turn Aaron's death into a ghost tale of the crazy mountains, or into a blame fest aimed at his companions, or into a cheap thrill about scattered bones and a 2-year mystery. All of those tellings exist, and all of them fail him. The honest way to tell it is the harder way, as a lesson and a remembrance at once, holding the practical warning and the human loss together without letting either crowd out the other. Aaron was a real man who died a real and preventable in hindsight death, and the most useful thing we can do with that is to learn from it while honoring him so that his loss might spare someone else, and so that he is remembered as a person and not a cautionary cartoon. You're in the mountains today, a hunter or a hiker like Aaron once was, standing at the edge of some high basin with the light beginning to go and a decision to make about whether to push on or turn back. In that moment, Aaron's story is worth carrying with you, not as fear and not as superstition, but as a quiet voice on the side of humility, a reminder that the most experienced among us are still mortal, that the cold is patient and merciless, and that there is no shame and much wisdom in stopping while you still can. If Aaron's death teaches anyone to make that choice differently, to stop and shelter and wait rather than press on into the dark, then his story will have done something more than break our hearts. It will have kept someone else's family from living the 2 years that his family had to live. For Aaron's family, the story carried a weight that lasted far beyond the search. They endured nearly 2 years of not knowing, of a loved one missing in the mountains with no body to bury and no certain end to mourn. They lived through the false comfort and fresh grief of each new discovery. The boots, the gear far to the north, each one confirming that Aaron was gone, and none of them bringing him home. And then at last, in the summer of 2016, they were given the hard mercy of an answer, remains found and confirmed, a place for their grief to finally rest. To be fair, it was the worst possible news, and it was also, after 2 years of suspension, a kind of release. They could stop searching, they could bury him, they could begin at last to grieve a death instead of an absence. That distinction between a death and an absence is the whole difference between Aaron's story and the ones that never resolve, and it is worth honoring. So many of the cases we sit with on these long nights never reach this point. The person is never found, and the family is left forever in the terrible open middle, grieving toward a question mark, unable to ever fully close the wound. Aaron's family came within sight of that fate. For 2 years they lived it, but the land, having kept him, eventually gave him back, and in doing so it spared them the cruelest version of this loss, the one with no ending at all. It is a small mercy, purchased at a terrible price, but in the long, dark catalogue of the missing, it is not nothing. There is no mystery in that giving back, and certainly nothing supernatural, whatever the folklore of the crazy mountains might suggest. The land kept Aaron because the country is vast and folded and thinly peopled, and it gave him back because eventually, inevitably, someone crossed the particular ground where he lay. That is all. But there is a kind of grace in it even so, a sense that the mountains and the plains, having done their indifferent worst, at last allowed a grieving family the answer they needed. The same country that took Aaron returned him. It took 2 years, and it asked a rancher walking his own land to be the instrument of it. But it happened, and because it happened, Aaron's story has an ending, and his family has a grave to visit, and that is more than the wilderness grants to many of the people it keeps. The community around them carried it too, the enormous search, the dog teams and the helicopters and the 50 ground searchers, the ranchers who found his gear and finally his remains. All of them were part of a long, collective effort to bring Aaron home. That effort did not save his life, because his life was very likely lost in the first day or two, before any search could have reached him. But it mattered anyway. It mattered that so many people gave so much to find him, that his family was not alone, that a whole region refused to simply let a good man vanish into the mountains without a fight. It is worth understanding how search and rescue actually works in country like this, because it is one of the quiet glories of the rural West. Most of the people who searched for Aaron were volunteers. Search and rescue in Montana, as in much of the Mountain West, runs largely on the unpaid effort of ordinary people, neighbors and ranchers and fellow hunters and members of the local county teams who drop their own lives and come out when someone is lost. They bring their own horses, their own dogs, their own knowledge of the country, and they give days of hard, dangerous work to look for a person most of them have never met. It is one of the last places in modern life where the old ethic still holds without question, the simple conviction that you do not leave a person out in the mountains, that a stranger in trouble is your responsibility too. You're in that world when someone goes missing, and the response is immediate and total. Word travels through the valley and the ranch country, and people who are doing 100 other things set them down and come. The county coordinates it, professionals bring in the aircraft and the specialized teams, but the backbone of it is neighbors, and the fuel of it is a refusal to accept that a person can simply disappear without every possible effort being made. For Aaron, that meant 50 and more people on the ground, dog handlers and horse packers and high country specialists, all of them giving their time and their sweat and their own safety to the search. They did not know in those days that Aaron was already almost certainly beyond saving. They searched as if he might be found alive, because that is what you do. That the search did not save Aaron does not make it a failure, and it is important to say so. The search could not have saved him, because he was very likely lost in the first day before any organized effort could have reached him, and because the hypothermia had carried him outside the search area entirely. But the effort mattered anyway, and it mattered in ways that have nothing to do with the outcome. It told Aaron's family that their loss was shared, that a whole community stood with them. It honored Aaron, treating his life as worth every resource and every risk. And in the long run, it was that same refusal to give up, carried by ranchers walking their own land across 2 years, that finally brought him home. To be fair, the mountains beat the search that September, but the community never truly stopped, and in the end, the community won the only victory that was still available, which was to find him at last and give his family the truth. In the end, it was that persistence, carried across 2 years, that finally gave his family the answer they needed when a rancher walked a piece of his own land and found what the mountains had been keeping. So let's come back one last time to Aaron himself and let the clues and the distances and the hard questions fall away. Remember Aaron Hedges, the man, the Bozeman outdoorsman who loved the high country of Montana and had earned his place in it over a lifetime. Remember the husband and the father who had every reason to come home and every intention of doing so. Remember that he walked into the crazy mountains that September as a capable, confident, living man, doing the thing he loved most in the world, with no idea that the trip would be his last. And remember, above all, that he fought. He built his fires against the dark and kept moving through the cold. He covered an almost unimaginable distance in the grip of that cold, refusing, even as his mind failed, to simply lie down and quit. Aaron did not give up. The cold took him anyway, but it did not take him easily. Tonight, as you think about Aaron Hedges' story, try not to remember him for the scattered gear or the 2 years missing or the hard questions about that last day. Remember him instead for who he was, a strong and capable man who loved the mountains and was loved in return by a family who never stopped looking for him. Remember that the wilderness he died in was also the wilderness he lived for, the country that gave him joy for decades before it finally kept him. And remember that behind the mystery of the scattered boots and the 15 miles, was a real person, fighting alone in the dark and the cold, trying with everything he had to come home to the people who were waiting. He did not make it, but he tried all the way to the end, and he deserves to be remembered for the trying. Aaron's family has him back now, at rest in the country he loved. May the rest of us carry his story and the lesson in it a little more carefully into the mountains we love too.